Imagine stepping onto a plane, expecting a smooth and luxurious flight, only to be met with judgment before you even reach your seat. That's exactly what happened to the Williams family, a self-made billionaire couple and their teenage son, who were looking forward to a peaceful journey on their own airline. But there was just one problem. The flight attendant had no idea who they were. From the moment they boarded, there was a shift in energy. Dressed in casual yet elegant outfits, the Williams family carried themselves with quiet confidence, but it didn't take long for them to notice the stares. Passengers whispered, some stealing glances as if trying to place them, but it was the flight attendant's reaction that set everything in motion. She barely acknowledged them as they found their first-class seats. No warm greeting, no offer to help with luggage, nothing. But when another well-dressed couple, who happened to be white, stepped in, she immediately brightened up, offering them champagne and addressing them with utmost respect. The difference was obvious. Mr. Williams exchanged a look with his wife, but said nothing, choosing to observe. Then came the moment that truly revealed her bias. As the Williams family settled in, their son politely asked for a bottle of water. The flight attendant, without even glancing at him, dismissed the request. "Was still getting everyone settled," she said curtly, but moments later she turned around and happily served the same request to a man just a few rows ahead. Mrs. Williams decided to speak up. "Excuse me, but my son just asked for the same thing." The flight attendant's face hardened. "Ma'am, I'll get to you when I can." There it was, a tone so cold, so dismissive, that it was impossible to ignore. The air grew tense. Other passengers started to notice. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended not to hear. But what the flight attendant didn't know was that she wasn't just being rude to any passengers. She was denying service to the very people who owned the airline she worked for. Mr. Williams took a deep breath, his patience thinning. He had worked too hard, built too much, to let something like this slide. His wife placed a calming hand on his arm, silently telling him to wait. They weren't going to say anything just yet. No, they would let her continue, let her dig this hole even deeper. Because when the truth finally came out, it was going to change everything. As the flight continued boarding, the Williams family remained patient, though the tension was hard to ignore. Mr. Williams leaned back in his seat, watching the flight attendant move effortlessly through the cabin, smiling warmly at some passengers while barely sparing others a glance. He wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. This wasn't just about a bottle of water. It was about something deeper, the kind of quiet discrimination that people like him had dealt with their whole lives, even after achieving success most could only dream of. Mrs. Williams, always the observant one, took in every detail. The way the flight attendant responded cheerfully to certain passengers, how she adjusted her tone depending on who she was speaking to, and most of all, how she continued to ignore them as if they didn't belong. She exchanged a knowing look with her husband. They had built this airline from the ground up, creating jobs, ensuring top-tier service, and making it one of the most respected in the industry. And yet, here they were, overlooked in their own first-class cabin. Their son Marcus shifted uncomfortably. At 16, he had grown up in privilege, but was no stranger to the way the world worked. He saw the way his parents were treated in certain places, how people made assumptions before knowing anything about them. But this was different. This was their airline, their rules. And this woman had no idea she was speaking to the people who signed her paycheck. As the final passengers took their seats, the flight attendant returned to the front to begin the safety demonstration. Her voice was smooth and professional, but it was clear she had no clue about the storm brewing in her own cabin. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was in control, someone who thought she could decide who mattered and who didn't. Mr. Williams took a slow breath. He wasn't one for public confrontation, but he also wasn't going to let this slide. He glanced toward the cockpit, knowing that the captain, someone who had been with that airline for years, would recognize him immediately. But that wasn't the plan. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the in-flight menu and flipped through it. When the flight attendant passed by again, he spoke in a calm, firm voice. "Excuse me, I'd like to place a drink order." She barely looked at him. "We'll be starting service after takeoff." "And what about them?" He nodded toward a couple of few seats away, who had just been served glasses of wine. The flight attendant hesitated, her expression flickering just for a second before she forced a polite smile. "They're loyalty members." Mrs. Williams let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Is that so?" The flight attendant, sensing something was off, straightened her posture. "Yes, ma'am. We have certain privileges for our frequent flyers." Mr. Williams nodded slowly, studying her. She was still completely unaware of who she was speaking to, and that was fine, because the truth was about to reveal itself in a way she never saw coming. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the Williams family remained silent, though the tension between them was growing. Mr. Williams tapped his fingers against the armrest, his mind running through the many ways he could handle the situation. He wasn't angry, he had dealt with worse. But there was something about this moment that felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about the culture they had built within their airline, the values they had instilled, and the fact that someone under their leadership was treating passengers this way. Mrs. Williams glanced around the cabin, noting the expressions of other passengers. Some had witnessed the way the flight attendant treated them, their gazes flickering between curiosity and discomfort. Others seemed oblivious, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the subtle discrimination happening right in front of them. But one person who had noticed everything was Marcus. Sitting up straighter, he leaned toward his mother and whispered, "She's still looking at us like we don't belong here." Mrs. Williams gave him a knowing smile, placing a reassuring hand over his. Some people always assume, sweetheart, but the truth always comes out. Meanwhile, the flight attendant, whose name tag read Lisa, carried on as if nothing was wrong. She walked down the aisle, her professional smile in place, making conversation with passengers she deemed important. Every now and then, her gaze flickered toward the Williams family, her expression unreadable. Maybe she was beginning to sense that something was off. Maybe she was starting to realize that her usual tactics wouldn't go unnoticed this time. A few minutes later, as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Lisa returned to begin meal service. When she reached the Williams family, she barely made eye contact. "Chicken or vegetarian?" she asked fatly. Mr. Williams looked at her for a long moment before replying, "What's the premium meal option?" Lisa blinked, as if surprised he even knew about it. "That's reserved for elite members," she said quickly. "And what if I want to order it?" he asked, tilting his head. She hesitated again, then let out a small, forced chuckle. "Well, I suppose you could pay extra." Marcus, unable to hold back anymore, scoffed. "So we can't get the same food as the other first-class passengers?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't say that." "But that's what you meant," Mrs. Williams said, her voice calm but firm. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a man sitting across the aisle cleared his throat. He had been watching the entire exchange, and now he spoke up. "Excuse me, miss," he said, addressing Lisa directly. "Are you aware of who you're talking to?" Lisa turned to him, frowning. "Sir, I." "You might want to choose your words carefully," the man interrupted, "because I think you're making a mistake, a big one." Lisa's confidence wavered for the first time. She looked between Mr. and Mrs. Williams, confusion creeping into her expression. There was something in the way they carried themselves, something she hadn't noticed before. The certainty, the quiet authority. It didn't match the picture she had painted in her mind. Mr. Williams smiled slightly, leaning back. He wasn't going to say it. Not yet. He wanted to see just how far Lisa would go, because once the truth came out, there would be no undoing it. Lisa's confidence was slipping. She could feel the shift in the air, the way a few passengers were watching her more closely now. That man across the aisle, why had he spoken up like that? And why were the Williamses still so calm, almost like they were waiting for something? Still, she pushed forward, determined to regain control of the situation. "Sir," she said, directing her words at Mr. Williams, "if there's an issue with service, you're welcome to file a complaint after the flight." Her voice was polite but clipped, as if she was eager to move on. But Mr. Williams wasn't letting it slide. "A complaint," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Interesting suggestion." Lisa pressed her lips together. "I'm simply saying we have procedures." "And I'm saying," Mrs. Williams cut in smoothly, "that we're not interested in filing a complaint. We're interested in seeing how this plays out." Lisa blinked. "Excuse me." Before either of them could respond, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude, and we want to thank you for flying with us today. We're proud to offer you the best service in the skies, and we hope you enjoy the flight." As soon as the announcement ended, Lisa's expression changed ever so slightly. Relief. She straightened her uniform and gave them a forced smile. "If you'll excuse me, I have other passengers to attend to." Without waiting for a response, she turned sharply and walked toward the galley, her heels clicking against the floor. Mrs. Williams exhaled slowly. She's feeling the pressure. Marcus grinned. She has no idea what's coming. Mr. Williams remained quiet, thoughtful. Then, after a moment, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Marcus and Mrs. Williams exchanged looks. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Taking a walk," he said, straightening his jacket. "It's about time I say hello to the captain." Lisa was in the galley when he approached. She didn't notice him at first, too busy whispering to another flight attendant. But when she turned and saw him standing there, something in her expression hardened. "Sir, passengers are not allowed in this area." "I'm aware," Mr. Williams said evenly. "I won't be long." Lisa narrowed her eyes. "I'll have to ask you to return to your seat." Mr. Williams smiled, calm, controlled, but undeniably in charge. "Actually," he said, glancing past her, "I think I'll have a quick word with the captain." Lisa's frustration was slipping into panic now. "Sir, I don't know what you think is happening here, but..." Before she could finish, the cockpit door opened, and the captain himself stepped out. His sharp eyes landed on Mr. Williams, and in an instant his entire demeanor changed. "Sir," the captain said, his voice filled with respect, "I had no idea you were on board. It's an honor." Lisa's face went pale. She looked between them, realization dawning, but it was too late. The moment she had been dreading was here, and there was no escaping it now. Lisa stood frozen, her face drained of color as the captain stepped forward with a warm, respectful smile. The power dynamic in the cabin had shifted in an instant, and she knew, without anyone having to say it, that she had made a terrible mistake. "Mr. Williams," the captain continued, shaking his hand firmly, "if I had known you were on this flight, I would have come out to greet you earlier. Is everything to your satisfaction?" Lisa Bailey breathed, her mind racing. Mr. Williams, the name clicked now. Not just any first-class passenger, not just some wealthy traveler. He was the owner, the man who built this airline. Her stomach dropped. Mr. Williams studied her carefully, taking his time before answering the captain. "Well," he said, his voice controlled but firm, "there have been some issues with the service." The captain's face darkened. "That's unacceptable. Let me know what needs to be fixed, and I'll handle it personally." Lisa took a small step back, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, to explain, to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say. She had treated the most powerful passengers on this flight like they didn't belong, because she had assumed they didn't. Then, just as she thought things couldn't get worse, a second voice entered the conversation. "I'd like to know something," Mrs. Williams said, standing a few feet away with Marcus at her side. She wasn't loud, but something in her tone made everyone, including Lisa, turn toward her. Lisa swallowed hard as Mrs. Williams walked forward, stopping just inches away. "If this is how you treat passengers you don't recognize, Mrs. Williams continued, her voice calm but razor-sharp. How do you treat the ones who don't have the resources to defend themselves? The words hit like a thunderclap. A few passengers gasped quietly. Lisa's breathing turned shallow. I would never, she stammered, but the words felt empty even as they left her mouth. You already did, Marcus said. His young voice carried more weight than Lisa expected, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes she wasn't ready for: disappointment. Lisa's pulse raced. She could feel the captain's eyes on her now, along with the scattered stares of other passengers who had witnessed it all. She had underestimated these people, had judged them without knowing who they were. And now she was standing in the wreckage of her own choices, exposed for everyone to see. Then, just when she thought Mr. Williams would deliver the final blow, something even more unexpected happened. The captain's radio crackled, and a voice from air traffic control came through. Urgent, clipped, slightly tense. Captain, we have a situation. A pause. One of your crew members needs to be removed from this flight, immediately. Lisa's heart stopped. The cabin fell silent. Lisa's breath hitched as the captain's radio crackled again. Repeat that, the captain said, his voice suddenly sharp. The reply came through, steady but firm. We've received an official request from Airline headquarters. A senior executive on board has flagged a crew member for immediate removal upon landing. Orders from the top. Lisa felt the ground shift beneath her. Headquarters, a senior executive. She turned slowly, her eyes landing on Mr. Williams, whose calm expression hadn't changed. But now she saw it clearly. He had never raised his voice, never made a scene, never even said who he was. Yet, with a single word, he had sent a message all the way up the chain of command. Panic gripped her chest. Sir, she said quickly, turning to Mr. Williams, her voice unsteady. This must be a mistake. I didn't realize. Didn't realize what? Mrs. Williams asked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. That you were treating people differently based on your own assumptions. Lisa's throat tightened. She had been caught. There was no way out. The captain exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Lisa, I need you to step into the galley, now. But, Captain, please, he stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been with this airline for years. This is my career. Mr. Williams finally spoke, his tone steady but unshakable. And in all those years, how many passengers have you treated like this? How many people have felt less than because you decided they weren't worth your attention? Lisa had no answer. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Some passengers looked away, pretending not to listen, while others, especially the man who had spoken up earlier, watched intently, waiting to see how this would end. Finally, the captain sighed. Lisa, return to the galley. We'll discuss this after landing. His voice was firm, but there was no sympathy in it. He turned to Mr. Williams. Sir, I want to personally apologize for... But Mr. Williams held up a hand. Save it. This isn't just about us. It's about the culture of this airline. An airline we built to be better than this. Lisa's eyes widened as the final piece clicked. Not only did they own the airline, but they had built it from the ground up. She had dismissed the very people who had created the company that signed her paycheck. She felt the weight of her mistake settle deep in her chest as she backed away, her face burning with humiliation. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the galley. A few moments later, Marcus leaned over to his father. So, is she fired? Mr. Williams sighed, shaking his head. That's not my call. Mrs. Williams arched an eyebrow. But you did make one call, didn't you? Mr. Williams only smiled. Let's just say, this flight is going to end very differently than she expected. The final shock came just before landing. As the plane descended, a quiet murmur spread through the first-class cabin. Passengers peeked out their windows, some leaning forward in their seats. Outside, waiting on the tarmac, was an airline executive team. A group of people in suits, standing near a security detail, their expressions unreadable. Lissa saw them too, and as the realization hit her, her knees nearly buckled. This wasn't just a warning, this was the end. The wheels touched down, and just like that, the flight attendant, who thought she was in control, found herself grounded. As the plane taxied to the gate, the tension in the air was undeniable. Lissa sat in the galley, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened.